Yo ho ho, welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you're keeping well. So today I have a pretty big book unhaul for you, and this is going to be like a mishmash of a video because we're going to do an unhaul. I'm also going to be doing a little bit of a reading vlog, and I'm also going to be taking you with me to actually trade in the books to get store credit and maybe potentially, hopefully, get some new used books into the collection. So I'll be starting out with the horror novels that I'm getting rid of. So the first one up is I Will Always Find You by John Ajavide Lindqvist. This is a book that I only picked up kind of recently in a charity shop, and I've been meaning to read more from this author because I read Let the Right One In. I really liked the cover too because it gave me that What Lies Beneath sort of vibe to it, but when I came home and looked it up I realised this was actually the second book in a series of 3, and I don't really want to be getting myself into another series at the moment, especially when I have a massive fantasy book haul where I'm going to be getting into several different series. I was just like, I'm not that invested to get into this one. Next, I have The Hunger by Alma Katsu. I read this about 2 or 3 years ago. I was really excited to get into it because it's a retelling of the infamous Donner Party, which, if you don't already know, the Donner Party were a group of people who were migrating in America, and they got stuck on a mountainside in the snow and ended up having to cannibalize each other. So it's already a fairly metal story as it is. And I just thought this retelling sounded really interesting. And initially I was really into it because in the first couple of chapters we just have children going missing, and I was like, yeah man, this is fairly hardcore, I can get behind this. But then it hit like this really long lull, and I feel like the middle part of the book just didn't really do anything for me, and then finally getting to the end of the book, it just left me wanting more, and I just felt unsatisfied. It just didn't go where I was hoping it would go. The real story is more scary than the retelling, you know, and it just left me disappointed. The next book I have is Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. This is a book that I really enjoyed when I read it, probably about like 10 or 11 years ago now. I read it during the summer holidays, and I stayed up all night trying to finish it because I was so invested in the story and wanted to find out what the hell was happening with these weirdo neighbours. But you know, recently I've decided to follow the Marie Kondo method, except I call it things that I'm sick of looking at and don't want anymore, and I fucking hate this cover. And I know that's a stupid reason to get rid of a book, but like, I've already talked about this book probably as much as I'm ever going to talk about it on the channel, at least. I hate the cover. I wish it was like red and black instead of red and silver. I just don't want it anymore. I'm tired of looking at this. I'm tired of looking at this spine on my shelf and just thinking, oh, you could have been designed so much better. And I know that's a stupid reason to get rid of a book, but you know what? I'm petty like that. The next book that's leaving my collection is White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi. So I read this a couple of years ago, and my overall feeling after finishing it was that it was incredibly overhyped. It also left me again wanting a bit more because I was under the expectation that this was going to be dipping into the occult, and it really wasn't. It was more centered around disordered eating and disordered thinking when it comes to food. I do enjoy reading books about mental health. Because I wasn't expecting that from this, I found it quite disappointing. I don't really want to be looking at it when it reminds me of just feeling disappointed, so this is gonna go. I'm also gonna be getting rid of my copy of Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Now don't be gasping. I loved this book, and I still love this book, and I still recommend this to anyone who hasn't read it yet, because I know a lot of the covers make it look like it's a romance, but it's really not, and I loved it. I thought it was great. The reason why I'm going to be getting rid of this copy is that I discovered my mum actually has a copy of it, and it's an old edition. It's a nice looking hardback. I'm really not the type of person who likes to have multiple copies of a book. I can understand people's excitement when it comes to that sort of thing, but I'm not that big of a fangirl of anything, so this can be passed on. The next book is actually one I haven't completed yet. It's a book that I tried reading about 2 years ago now, and I really didn't enjoy it at the time, which is why it's made itself onto this list, but I'm planning to read it before the end of this video, so you never know, I may end up keeping it. But it is Hex by Thomas Oldhoyvelt. I'm used to reading classics and stuff, and when a book references like real life websites, I find it really jarring and it takes me out of it. If you don't know anything about this book, it follows a group of teenagers who have been living in a lockdown because their town is kind of cut off from everywhere else based on the fact that it's been haunted by a witch. And this witch has been around for years and years. She's had her eyes and mouth sewn shut, and if they're opened, all hell's going to break loose from what I gather. But these kids are just frustrated by the fact that they have to track this witch on an app. They always have to be double guessing what's coming next, and then they decide to take matters into their own hands. And teenagers aren't the smartest and stuff, especially when it comes to wanting a bit of freedom. I just didn't gel well with the writing style of this, but I am going to force myself to like bum rush this book at the weekend. And I don't mean like I'm going to skim it or anything, but I will actually read it and then determine whether it's something I want to keep or not. I absolutely hate getting rid of things that I haven't used. I hate wasting my money, especially since we're currently in a cost of living crisis. I find it really distasteful seeing people like buy things they don't need and then get rid of them a few months later just for the sake of content. And especially when it comes to like book unhauls where people haven't read the majority of the books that they're getting rid of, I just view that as kind of non-tent because it's just like a show and no tell. Anyway, that's my little rant over. I'm going to be reading this. I'll let you know my thoughts a little later. Next, I'm going to be getting into the fantasy. So the first book that I'm going to be getting rid of from the fantasy genre is The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I'm not getting rid of this because I didn't like it. In fact, I love the Lord of the Rings series. It's very dear to my heart. And because of that, I'm planning to actually upgrade my copies into the hardback editions. Now that I have proper book storage and now that they can be on display, it's the perfect time to finally treat myself to them because I've just wanted to upgrade them for such a long time. I love those hardback copies. And if I get rid of this, it will give me the motivation to do so because you can't really have like a good fantasy collection without the Lord of the Rings. The next book that I'm saying goodbye to is The Assassin's Quest. So again, don't be gasping. I haven't actually read this book yet either. But the reason I'm getting rid of this copy is because it's a duplicate. So when I initially bought this off the Book Depository, RIP, like 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't get it. I was waiting for about 35 days after it had been dispatched, and I was like, okay, if it isn't here now, it's probably never going to get here. So I got in contact with them and they sent me out a new book, but weirdly enough, both copies arrived on the same day. So I was like, this is suspicious. I've just been holding on to this duplicate copy for all that amount of time, and it could be going towards someone else that's brand new. It's in excellent condition. I know someone else is going to find this and be delighted with themselves. So I'm going to be saying goodbye to Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I wasn't a huge fan of this at the time that I read it. I feel like this was really neglected by time because if I had read it when I was a teenager, I know I probably would have really enjoyed it then. But you know how there's certain books that if you don't read it at a certain age, it's just kind of lost on you, or you just aren't going to find it particularly meaningful because you're past the age of enjoyment. That's kind of how I felt with this. I also felt like it could have been a much longer novel than it actually is. There are certain themes in it and certain topics brought up that I would have loved to have been explored a little bit more, but it just felt, towards the end of it, it felt a little bit rushed. So I know I'm never going to reread it again, so I'm going to say goodbye to this. I'm also getting rid of Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Now, if you've been following me for a good while, this will probably be a surprise for you because I loved this book at the time that I read it. It's one of the few books that has ever made me get choked up while reading because I found it so moving. But the thing is, I know I'm never going to reread it again. Not because I found it so like emotional, but just because I have thought about it and I've analysed the text as much as I ever am going to. So I feel like I'm at a loss for anything else to do with this book. I've referenced it in videos. I included it in the Books That Ruined My Life video because I found it so sad at the time. I know I'm never going to need a copy of it on hand because I've kind of said everything that I wanted to say about this book. Also going to be getting rid of Trainspotting by Irvine Welsh. I have read this, well, I tried reading it like 3 or 4 times and then I finally did manage to read it probably about 10 years ago or so, and I was really happy with myself once I got through it because it is a notoriously difficult book to read just based on the fact that the characters' dialogue is written in a Scottish accent. You have to use your knowledge of phonetics to get through this in order to understand what the characters are saying to each other. This is another book that I know I'm never going to reread, and again, I'm just kind of sick of looking at the spine on my bookshelf. The next book that I'm letting go of is Imperial Bedrooms by Bret Easton Ellis. So I'm a huge fan of Bret Easton Ellis's writing. He's one of my all-time favorite authors. He's like an auto-buy author for me, but I really didn't enjoy this. I read this last year finally, and if you don't know, it's a sequel to his first novel, Less Than Zero, which I was a really big fan of. This takes place place around 20 to 30 years after the events in the first novel, and everyone's kind of like middle-aged and more fucked up than ever. There was a good amount of violence in this towards the end, and usually I'm not bothered by that. The violence in this just felt very ham-fisted, and it felt like it was only there for shock value. And it just didn't feel suited for the particular characters. I was really disappointed with this. This was one of the worst books that I read last year, unfortunately. Next is Sybil by Flora Rita Schreiber. So I read this a couple of years ago purely because I knew it was so controversial. If you don't know, this book is about a woman who had multiple personality disorders, and then it was proven to be completely fake. So it was written as non-fiction, and then it came out that things were wildly exaggerated, and the woman herself believed that she had been faking it. And then she came out later on and said, no, well, some of it's true. To be honest, the main reason I'm getting rid of this is the fact that it's one of the most explicit, graphic books that I've ever read. When it comes to the splitting of oneself, it usually stems from some sort of trauma. And that didn't really occur to me when I initially started the book. And then the trauma came. And you realize like, oh, this is so much darker than I ever could have ever anticipated. And it was just disgusting to me. It was just so like over the top and just horrific that I was like, I really don't want to keep reading this. And again, you know me, I love reading weird, fucked up shit. But with this, I was like, ugh. And also because she was a child at the time as well, it was like everything that I don't want to be reading about, basically. Now I'll get into some of the non-fiction that I'm getting rid of. My non-fiction collection is already quite small, but there's certain books that I just don't need them anymore. I don't need to keep them on hand for reference or anything. So the first one that's going is going to be Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. I read this when I was a teenager. I think I was like 16 or 17 at the time. I read it because I was having my own issues with mental health, and I wanted to be able to feel like I could relate to someone. And to be honest, whenever I see this book sitting on my shelf, whenever I see the spine, which again is really sun-faded as well for some reason, this just reminds me of when I was in a really bad headspace. So I'm happy enough to be passing this on to someone who may need it. Another book that I'm getting rid of for the exact same reason is An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jameson. I have a bit of a funny story though attached to when I read this. I went over to Paris a couple of years ago to visit a friend, and I decided to bring some books with me, and I thought reading non-fiction on a plane would be really good. It would just, make the time pass super fast. And I was completely wrong, because the first page of this book opens with a plane crash, and I was sitting on this plane being like, what the fuck are the odds of that? Trust my luck, basically, it'd be just my luck that something bad would happen. Next up is Last Night at the Viper Room by Gavin Edwards. This is a biography on the life and death of actor River Phoenix. I was really into several of River Phoenix's films a couple of years ago, when I was in my late teens, early 20s. And I really liked his music that he made at the time, and I was just fascinated about the story of his life, especially if you know nothing about the Phoenix family. Basically, they were in the cult Children of God, and if you know anything about cults, you know how awful that particular one was. It really does follow the kind of downfall and all the pressure that was put on him. I feel like I'm never gonna need to go back to it for any reason, but it was a really good biography. Next is another book that I'm still kind of debating on whether I should keep or actually get rid of, but I think I will pass it along. It's I'm With the Band by Pamela Des Barres. So Pamela Des Barres is one of the world's most famous groupies, and I was really into reading about musicians and the kind of groupie culture. It was when I was on Tumblr, so that kind of will give you an understanding to my mindset at the time. This was really enjoyable. It wasn't at all over the top or graphic or anything like that. It was really kind of written in a romanticized sort of way, and Pamela recounts several encounters with really famous rock stars. But again, I don't think I'm ever going to revisit it. Now I'm going to be getting into the classics. I'm actually getting rid of a good few classics for me. A lot of the time I like keeping my classics that I've read just as proof that I've read them, but also I feel like it says something, intellectual about me, when in reality it really doesn't, unless anyone comes over who is a big reader themselves, and then they'd be like, maybe find that impressive. First one is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Now I love this book. It's one of my all-time favorites. When I read it at the time, I gave it 5 stars. I believe it's a book that everyone should read once in their lifetime. But the reason I'm getting rid of this is because it has a lot of water damage in the back, and it's actually damaged some of the pages and the ink has run, and I just need a new edition of it. Basically, I had a bit of a spillage a couple of months ago with a bucket of water, a bucket of bleach water, should I say, and some of my books got really destroyed, but most of them were okay. It was just annoying because I had to sit there for like 3 hours with the hairdryer on all of them. I'm going to be replacing this copy. Next up is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. So this is another book that I reviewed on the channel a couple of years ago, and it's so weird because I have such a habit of getting rid of books that I have done like solo reviews on or just talked about a lot on the channel, because I feel like I've gotten absolutely every bit of information that I could possibly need out of certain books, and I'm just happy enough to pass them on. And I know that if I'm never going to read it again, there's no real point in holding on to it because it's just taking up space, even though this takes up the tiniest little bit of space. I did really enjoy it when I read it at the time, but I will say it didn't age particularly well because there's some use of language that would be considered kind of problematic or distasteful by today's standards. But yeah, I don't need this. Another book that I'm getting rid of is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. So you might be surprised by this because I love Gothic horror, and this is one of like the fundamental books when it comes to reading Gothic horror. I think this is one that would be great for beginners, but that is the reason why I'm going to be getting rid of it, because I read it quite late in my Gothic horror journey and I didn't really enjoy it. I feel like if this was one of the first books that I had read, I would have really enjoyed it, but I just found it a little bit too tropey. I didn't like that it wasn't from the perspective of either character. It was actually like an onlooker. I think it was a lawyer or something like that. I felt a little bit distanced from the story because of that. I'm also not really a huge fan of the Penguin English Library editions anymore, and I'm slowly trying to get rid of them and get either the Penguin Black Classics or the Modern Classics in my collection, because those are books that I prefer. I also enjoy having resources listed in classics, and I don't really think there's much in here aside from an introduction and another short story. The next book is Animal Farm by George Orwell. I feel like I've gotten everything out of it that I'd ever need, and it really has just been a placeholder on my bookshelf for the last couple of years. Again, I feel like George Orwell is a great author to read in your teenage years or early 20s, but when you're a bit older, it does kind of lose its potency of how impactful it's going to be on you. I love the story naturally. I think the metaphors in it were great, but I know I'm never going to reread it again. Next is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, another Penguin English Library edition. Again, another one of my all-time favourite books, and because of that reason, I actually recently upgraded to the Penguin Classics Deluxe Edition. I don't need 2 copies, so this can go. For the exact same reason, I'm going to be saying goodbye to Dracula by Bram Stoker. I am planning to upgrade into the Penguin English Library edition for this as well. And you know what? This is a vintage edition. It's a vintage red spine, and I'm really not a fan of these editions. I believe I only have one vintage book left in my collection, which is Brave New World, because I love that book. And that is the one red spine I can forgive, but I don't like them. I don't like the quality of them. I don't like the fact that the font size is often incredibly small in them. These are editions that I'm not going to be buying in future. Then I have On the Road, the original scroll by Jack Kerouac. I really didn't like this book when I read it. I'm going to try to be as like eloquent and polite as possible when talking about this, but I am so sick of seeing this damn book. This has really put me off trying anything else by him, because it is a lot. And I know that he wrote it in 3 weeks, and I know that that's meant to be impressive, but like, edit. If you're going to read this, I recommend getting the edited down version of it, because this was just a lot. It took me like a month to read this. It's not even that big of a book. I would have rather invested that month's worth of reading time into a book that was actually like over 1,000 pages that I was genuinely interested in reading, and not a book that I felt like I should read based on its historic relevance. And now finally, I'm going to be getting into my last genre, which is manga and comics. But firstly, I'm going to get into the manga. So the first one up is Romina by Junji Ito. I read this about 2 years ago, really didn't enjoy it. I'd seen other people weren't rating it highly at all, and I was thinking maybe it's just them. It's not just them, it's just not a particularly strong story. In my opinion, this really should have been included in a collection of stories and not just be the only story. There is some beautiful imagery in it, but I couldn't suspend my disbelief when it came to events that were especially towards the end of the book. I just thought it was a bit ridiculous and over the top, and there was just a lot of coincidences where certain characters should have died and didn't, and they were just, you know, miraculously still here. Next is Censor. I again feel like this should have been part of a collection. It is a really, really beautiful edition, but that can't be all that it is. This was a strange story focusing on hair. I'll just leave it at that, but I don't really enjoy the stories that Junji Ito writes focusing on beauty standards and stuff like that. And again, I just didn't find the story particularly memorable. And the last Junji Ito book that is not staying in my collection is Black Paradox. I was so excited for this when it came out, and this is the last Junji Ito book that I pre-ordered, and I decided based on the fact that I didn't like this that I'm not going to be pre-ordering any of his other works from now on. I'm just going to wait until they come out and see other people's reactions to it, and then base whether I want to get a new collection of his stories or not on reviews that I see. I thought the plot of this initially sounded really good because it's about a group of people who meet on a messaging board and they plan to end their lives together. But then it takes a bit of a turn, and there's like doppelgangers involved and other universe sort of stuff. Just didn't make sense to me. I couldn't wrap my mind around what was the point of the actual story. And I hate feeling like that. I hate when books make me feel like that. I hate when books make me double guess myself. As much as I loved the cover of this and everything and how good it looks on my shelf, I can't keep it. I'm on the final stretch now. I'm going to just quickly talk about the graphic novels that I'm going to be getting rid of, and going to try my best to get through them as fast as possible because I really don't want to get heat stroke standing here anymore. The first up is Witches. I really enjoyed this when I read it. I also did a review of it on the channel at the time, and the reason I'm getting rid of this is because it was meant to be a series but nothing has ever come of it, and I'm just tired of waiting for the potential of a volume 2 to come out. I'm just disappointed because I really would have loved to see the continuation of this story, but there's no point in keeping it when there's nothing going to come of it. Next is Ghost World by Daniel Klaus. This is one that I have read back to front to back. I'm never going to read it again. Then I have the Wonder Woman Chronicles Volume 1. Saying goodbye to this because I read it, I kind of get it. There's no reason for me to continue on. Also, a lot of the other volumes that came out after this are now out of print and really difficult to find. I love Wonder Woman as a superhero character, and I did just keep this for the longest time because I was like, this is my representation of how much I love her. I read the original stories, but I'm happy enough to pass this on. Then I have Joker by Brian Azzarello. This was the first graphic novel I ever received. It was a gift from a friend for Christmas when I was like 15 or 16. I really loved the grittiness of the story, but I know I'm never going to read it again. In the same vein is Batman, The Killing Joke by Alan Moore. I love Alan Moore. He is one of my all-time favourite authors, but I think I'm just at a point in my life where I'm kind of over reading about superheroes and supervillains and all that sort of thing. I prefer like graphic memoirs rather than just reading about a traumatized superhero who's just not been able to process his parents' death. So yeah, I loved this story. It's a great one if you haven't read it. And funnily enough, the last book in my Unhaul is The Last Look by Charles Burns. Now, Charles Burns wrote Black Hole, which is one of my all-time favourite graphic novels and novels, basically. I love viruses. I love anything to do with that style of horror. So I picked up Last Look and I did really enjoy it at the time. There's some really cool, gross artwork within it. And it's a story about a character whose life is kind of falling apart as he's had some sort of head injury and is suffering from memory loss. And he's just kind of dealing with his trauma and he's going in and out of consciousness. And so we have like the real moments in his life, and then we have the things that he is like imagining or hallucinating or dreaming about. Definitely recommend it if you're into kind of weirder graphic novel stories, but it's an awkward size. It's a really huge book and I'm just kind of tired of looking at it. So that has been my massive book unhaul. It's definitely the biggest unhaul that I've done on this channel so far. It always feels good to declutter and purge certain items that you just know that you have no use for anymore. So stay with me now because I'm going to be adding on my reading vlog of Hex and we'll see how I get on with it. Cutting in for just a moment. This is Real Time Roya. Hi, how are you? How's it going? I accidentally deleted my vlog footage for Hex. I thought I'd put it in the vlog already and then just deleted the kind of raw thing, and it turns out I didn't. So I've had this unhaul sitting on my computer for like 7 months now, and instead of just scrapping it because I did edit it and have it ready to go for the most part, I thought, why not add on an additional unhaul, like a real-time haul from like the books that I'm getting rid of while I'm on my book buying ban. And I also, funnily enough, still have my copy of Hex because it slipped back in the cupboard that I was keeping all my books that I was going to unhaul, that you'll see in the next segment. So it's kind of weird that I still have it and that I can actually hold it up while I just give you my brief review after reading it. Initially, when I started it, I was like, okay, maybe this isn't as bad as I remember it, you know. The opening scene, for the most part, is this witch showing up in someone's house, and the mother of the house just puts a dish rag over her head, which is hilarious because it reminded me of that Novimpia video of like, I'm addicted to pretending to being furniture, if any of you are familiar with that. People in this village are very used to this witch just popping up in places, and you gotta remember, she's got her mouth sewn shut, she's got her eyes sewn shut, and they need to remain shut. Once you move to the town, you can't leave because you can't tell anyone else who's not from this town about this secret about this witch showing up and stuff. We learned about the witch's history and what was happening in kind of real time with her and stuff, and what led up to how her body was put into this position and why this curse has fallen upon this town. And we have a couple of teenagers who were probably my least favourite characters. I will say that the slang that they use is incredibly dated. At a certain point, they're kind of like having a bit of banter between each other, and one of them literally just says, "Da fuck?" And I was just like, no. Even the slurs that are used in this are, you know, very dated and stuff, and it's very off-putting as well, kind of just reading it in this day and age. And, you know, you have this one young male teenager who's a bit of an edgelord, who's always kind of pushing the boundaries with the witch and trying to freak his friends out and just trying to, you know, prove that he's like the manliest and he's not scared. And there's a certain scene that I really disliked in this where he is basically kind of goading the witch, and you gotta remember, she's basically the equivalent to like a mummy, just standing there and popping up in these various different places, but she doesn't do anything. He is like joking around with his friends, and he like gets a stick, and I think he has like a knife on the end of the stick from what I remember, and he's like poking at her and stuff. Then he moves her garment aside and like one of her tits falls out, and then he starts making like jokes about her, and it's just like the only interesting character aside from the witch herself was the mother of like the unhinged lad who was doing all this like edgelord shit. Her relationship with the witch was quite interesting, and she suffers a lot based on the actions of her son, because the people in the town hold her accountable, obviously, and you do feel sorry for her and stuff. So that's like the only kind of like one redeeming sort of character within this. But aside from that, I thought the story was a bit dull. I thought it was annoying how the whole tracking the witch on the app was never actually explained. It really didn't deliver on what I expect from like a witchy paranormal tale, and a lot of people say like, well, read it because the ending's worth it. The ending's not worth it. It really just was not for me. I think the only interesting bit was kind of like halfway through. The pacing kind of picked up, and I was kind of more interested to find out what was going to be the ultimate revelation and stuff, but then I was just disappointed by the end of it. I'd say if you're someone who is planning on reading this, maybe get it from the library, or, you know, get it as like a rented audiobook or something like that. This was officially the worst book that I read in 2023, so hey. So obviously, of the current batch of books that I'm going to be taking into chapters again this week, obviously Hex is the first one to go. Then I'm going to be getting rid of Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. I picked this up in a charity shop about 2 years ago in hopes that I was going to read it, and I just haven't had the motivation to do so. Now, the plot synopsis does sound like it's right up my street, but to be honest, I do kind of feel bad in the sense of like trying to separate art from the artist, because obviously everyone knows that Orson Scott Card is incredibly homophobic and stuff. And it's funny because in the next segment of when I'm taking the books into chapters, I pan on one of his other books, and it is very homoerotic looking, I have to say. So I don't know, I thought that was kind of funny. I've seen this down at my library, and I figure, you know, instead of just having it take up space, I'd rather, if I am going to read it, I'd rather just get it from the library. Then we have have this thing Between Us by Gus Morneau. This was a really overhyped kind of TikTok recommendation for me, and I'm finding now I've read like a handful of books from various TikTok creators like within the horror community, and I'm just finding that their taste is not aligned with mine whatsoever. This again was another really disappointing read of 2023. It's about a man who loses his wife in a subway accident, and a young man is held accountable for it because he's basically the one who knocked her over, and there is this kind of very subtle discussion over like immigration and stuff, but it didn't really feel very impactful, and I feel like the author was trying to make that the kind of social commentary of the novel, but it just didn't. It kind of fell flat for me. There is a mix of like cosmic horror in this, and I just was kind of disappointed by it. I also felt that it really borrowed from Pet Sematary quite a lot, and I just figured like if you're going to read this, or if you're going to read Pet Sematary, you're probably off better reading Pet Sematary. It felt kind of dull to me, to be perfectly honest, and it was one of those books that while I was reading it I was like, okay, I can't wait to be finished this and move on to something that I'm hopefully going to enjoy. Then speaking of Stephen King, I'm going to be getting rid of this copy of Carrie. This is the first Stephen King book I ever read, and I just hate this edition of it, and now seeing that there's 2 editions that have come out while I'm on my book buying ban. I think it's a hardback like special edition. I haven't seen it in person. I'm obviously avoiding bookshops like the plague at the moment, but that looks awesome. Or there's one that has come out in like the newer editions that are currently being published, but it does have like a 50-year anniversary sticker on it, which I don't particularly like. This was funny because I feel like a lot of people don't really enjoy this book, and it has that kind of like mixed media thing where it's like jump cutting from Carrie's ongoing story to what happened after her prom, and like newspaper articles and studies that have been written about the events that happened at this prom and stuff. I feel like at first I was so put off by that, and then eventually I kind of got into it, and I feel like this is the first book that really kind of got me into that style of writing. I want to replace it with a better edition. I'm going to also be passing along this copy of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I picked this up in a charity shop again, either last year or the year before last. I read it from the library a couple of years ago. I talked about it on the channel then. This is considered the first true crime novel ever written, but it is very biased because of Truman Capote's relationship with the 2 lads on the cover. It wasn't my favourite. It felt kind of devoid of Truman Capote's like notorious personality and stuff. And it felt like it was like he was trying to be very serious, and then things kind of like take a turn when he becomes like more empathetic for the 2 perpetrators of this crime. And I was just thinking to myself, like, you know, I wasn't a big fan of this when I read it. I don't see the purpose of me having a copy of it. Like, the only reason I'd have it is just for the sake of having it, rather than to be like, oh, I'm going to use it for a reference point in the future when I make a video about X, Y, or Z. So yeah, I'm just going to pass it along. This has a little bit of damage, so I don't think I'll be taking it into chapters. I might just end up recycling it. Is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. This is the first Philip K. Dick novel I ever read. I absolutely loved it. It's the book that Blade Runner is based on. And yes, I prefer the book to the film, even though the film was fantastic as well. And yeah, I just want to upgrade this. It got a little bit of water damage there a while ago. That's my excuse for everything. Like, if anything's going in the bin or getting recycled, I'm like, it's water damage, or it's damp damage, or it's moldy. But yeah, so I want to upgrade this to a better edition because I feel like it's one of my favorite books of all times, so therefore I should have a lovely edition of it. Then I'm also getting rid of a book that I tried to read. This is actually the only DNF of 2024 so far. I got this book for free at an Unpost book event back in February. It was in their goodie bag because it was going to be the next book that they read for their book club, and I tried to read it and it just really wasn't my cup of tea, so I'm going to be passing this along to somebody else. And again, it's in basically brand new condition, so I'm sure someone's going to be really happy to find this. The next book I'm actually really disappointed about that I have to get rid of. This is actually going to be going into the bin. It's this edition of Ordinary Monsters. It's the nice hardback edition. It's gorgeous. It's like fucking brand new. I got this last year at some point, and the reason why I have to get rid of it is because for some reason it keeps growing mold, and it's on the actual fabric book binding that the mold grows on the top and the bottom. For some reason this is like the only book that does that. Like, all my other hardbacks were fine. I can't treat the mold on it without actually damaging the book. Like, I'm an expert at getting rid of mold these days. I would just ruin the book, so I'm just going to put it in the bin because the mold is going to keep growing back on it. And then finally, the last book that I'm going to be trading in is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This is a reminder for future Roya that if you decide to read any more celebrity memoirs, get them from the library, despite the wait list, if they're super popular, because I never hold on to celebrity memoirs. I feel like they're real one and dones. Like, I'm not going to hold on to it for like future reference point. I'm not going to hold on to it for like a future video or anything like that. Yeah, and I don't have the urge to ever reread this. A lot of people commented when I did my wrap up, including this, which was my last video, I think it was, saying that the audiobook is much better. I just felt like she wasn't putting a whole heap of personality into it. It was very kind of matter-of-factly written, and I just wasn't necessarily impressed by the writing style, especially since a lot of people had been hyping up like she's such a great writer, like oh my god, it's such a great book and stuff. I think that's like one of the things you look for in a celebrity memoir, like what are they really like as a person. So this is the little stack of books that I'm going to be trading into chapters this coming week. I'm meant to be going in there on Saturday, and I'm glad that I've been able to empty basically just the equivalent to like one of these little cubby shelves. So yeah, and this is the book on haul within the book on haul, the current book on haul of 2024. Now we're going to take a step back in time to go unhaul the first round of books in chapters. So yeah, let's get ready and leave and go into chapters. Okay, so I'm back from chapters now. I was actually going to start by saying that didn't take too long at all. No, it didn't take too long to actually trade in the books. It took them about 5 minutes to tot up the amount that I was due in credit, and yeah, that was grand. And luckily I still have a little bit of credit left over as well because I didn't manage to spend it all today. But I was actually there browsing through all the books for about 2 hours. So much so that I feel like the security man was a bit sus of me. I probably looked through every department of the used book section there in hopes of finding something. I unfortunately didn't find that much. I feel like their horror section was really picked over at the moment, and also they're in the process of moving things around, so I feel like, you know, the place is a bit all over the place at the moment, and it's kind of hard to find what you're looking for, or hard to find like the certain sections that have now moved around. But anyway, let's get into the whole section of this video. So the first book that I found was Some Will Not Sleep by Adam Neville. This is an author that I've only read one of his books previously, which was The Ritual, which I really enjoyed. So I'm hoping that this short story collection will be able to deliver the same sort of like creepy folk horror that The Ritual did. So from what I can tell on the back of this is that it involves various different elements of horror. So it's not just folk, there's like a good bit of like paranormal stuff too. There's like hauntings, and there may be some sort of like culty sort of thing going on as well. So it really does sound like my cup of tea. It sounds like it's going to have a little bit of everything that I'm going to enjoy, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this soon. And I couldn't believe that this was there. I feel like finding actual kind of contemporary popular horror authors in used bookstores or charity shops is just like impossible. So the fact that this was there, I was like, yes, you're going straight in my basket. Then the next book that I found was The Summer That I Died by Ryan C. Thomas. This is a book that I've only seen talked about on TikTok pretty much. I am very much involved, well, I'm very much a lurker in the horror TikTok book talk side of things, and I have been looking up a lot of people's like most disturbing book lists and stuff that they've done on there, and this is one that I see time and time and time again. I know that it's independently published and that this is also meant to be a series, but I'm not too sure if this author's actually put out any more books in this particular series. I believe it was published in the late 2000s. This is about like two friends who are on their summer holidays, and they get entangled with some sort of serial killer and basically have to fight for their lives in order to get out, get free, all that sort of thing, survive. It's meant to be really brutal, really gory, really disturbing, and like I said, I see it on so many people's top 10 like most disturbing books of all time. So I'm wondering how I'm gonna feel when I read it, because I'm always looking for kind of disturbing reads, because I feel like I'm always more moved by kind of like negative based stories, you know, rather than kind of like stuff based in like happiness and good stuff and all that sort of thing. I always find that I'm more moved when it comes to, you know, like I always say, it's like that scale in Donnie Darko where it's like fear and love, and he's like, you can't just break things down into that. I feel like if I was to put myself on that scale, it would always be down in fear when it comes to the kind of content that I like to consume. So yeah, really looking forward to this, although I am somewhat like iffy about getting into it. I don't want to say that I have high hopes for this, but I am interested in seeing how popular that it is over on the horror book talk side of things, and seeing how I'm going to feel about it when I do finally get to it. And then aside from those two books, I did manage to find a little bit of manga. Now I don't know how you guys feel about me talking about manga on the channel, because I know that like for the most part there are plenty of other channels that specifically focus on manga, and I tend to read like, you know, horror related manga or like weird manga and stuff like that. I don't read kind of like popular stuff, and I don't read a ton of it, but I do read it now and again. So I found the first 3 books in the Battle Royale series. So we've got the first one, the second one, and then the third one. From what I can tell is that this series is currently out of print, so I was really lucky to come across these. Now they're not in great condition, but I didn't buy them to like add to a collection. I bought them to read them. I've read the actual book that the manga is based on, 500-page book, and I read it in like 2 days because it was such a binge read for me. So I'm expecting this will be more of the same. I'm expecting that the artwork in this, from just flipping through it, is going to be quite gory and disturbing and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into the series. I feel like it's going to be a really difficult one to end up completing though, based on the fact that, like I said, it is out of print, unless there are plans to put a new kind of like reissue of the series out or anything like that. But I feel like stumbling across them in the wild like I did is just incredibly rare and incredibly lucky. So yeah, the first 3 books in the Battle Royale series. Very much looking forward to getting into them. So those are all the books that I managed to get today. Like I said, I still have a little bit of money left over on my credit note, so I'll probably go back into chapters in a couple of weeks, maybe when they've got the store a little bit more organized, and hopefully they'll have like, you know, newer books in the used section and stuff like that, and more of a selection basically. And if you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on TikTok and Instagram, and of course please feel free to like and subscribe to the channel here, because it really helps me out, and especially if you're interested in the kind of content that I'm putting out, it's definitely a good idea to do so. So that is everything for today. This was an endeavour of a video. It took me a really long time to finally wrap up, and it feels very good being able to kind of wrap it up now. So let me know your thoughts, and of course I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.